So, when I was a teenager, in my freshman year of high school, it kind of started the summer beforehand, but I became essentially like a form of ritualistic Satanist, and I used to spend a lot of time talking with demons, speaking with demons, learning from them. They would show up in my room and they would talk to me. They would discuss different components of life, as it were. Mostly it was different ways to lie, to manipulate. They taught me that to lean on the knowledge that I had in order to, especially of the Bible, in order to break down other Christians. Now, in the process of that, they taught me about lying and deceit and manipulation and how best to do that. I knew how to gaslight before I knew what gaslighting was. I knew how to deceive people, how to use red herrings, how to use straw man arguments, all before I had any convention for what any of those things actually were. I could do it, but I had no idea that there was a term for it. I only learned about all that later on. And it was always just like, I learned all these little tips and tricks and different things like that. But one of the big things that I remember learning about was that of creating your story and then maintaining that. See, the thing was that in order to cast your little web of lies, you had to maintain each strand with each person. So if I was going to go to Aaron and tell him one thing, one set of lies, one story, I would have to remember that Aaron was the one that I was lying to and maintaining that story with. And at the same time, to remember that my line of lies and stories with Heather was completely different, and also to never cross the streams on that, lest it become incredibly sticky. And even if they started to get wise to me, to immediately distract them onto something else. That's where strawman arguments were incredibly effective. You use red herrings and strawmans in those particular instances in order to avoid having people catch on to the weakness in your arguments or catch on to your mistakes here. It's a distraction. And with every single person, you have to maintain a story of lies and deceit and different things like that as you continue to press on that particular that narrative that you're trying to maintain. This is what I was taught by the demons who would show up and talk to me. And I did it in high school, in the first couple of years, before I realized just how incredibly tedious it was. See, the thing that nobody really appreciates about deceit, about lying, is how much effort you have to put into it. See, if you show up and tell everybody the truth all the time, it's really easy. People will like you or not like you, and that'll be it. That's the end of it. You show up with the honest, the most pure and authentic version of yourself, and you'll find out real quick who your friends are and who are not. Who loves you and who doesn't. It's quick. Painful, but quick. Far less painful than when your web of lies gets found out. As the disguise you've been wearing gets kind of lifted up and they see the real you, and then they hate you for it. Because it's not enough to find out that you're a different person. that's already jarring enough. But to find out that you had been manipulating them and lying to them for such a long time, people are not forgiving about that by any stretch of the imagination. When they see it for what it is and really have to face it, and they can't continue to pretend like you are who you said you were, all hell breaks loose. So with that, I realized at a fairly young age, I was a sophomore in high school, that this was way too much work. And I really had no interest in maintaining it. And a lot of that is what drove me to kind of like walk away from that lifestyle. I was being trained and taught all these things, and in the end, it was just a waste of time. But see, the funny thing about that is that all of that stuff I just talked about, as far as the way that we handle, the way that we can create this narrative around other people, is just as much a thing that we can do to ourselves. See, one of the biggest problems that we have, and this message dovetails off of last week's message, like, consider it like a part 2, as it were, because this is about those the kind of fake identities that we make up and maintain. You know, last week we talked about the way in which a lot of us we use the analogy of like a decorator crab, and the way that they gather things from their environment in order to camouflage with their environment, in order to blend in. Well, it's all a ruse. It's not different. Do you know the difference between a ruse and deceit? And the difference between lies and deceit? There's none. It's all the same thing. It's just variations on the same concept. And this is where a lot of us sit. We don't even know it, though. Like, this is the difficult part whenever we discuss this issue. There are so many people who are living in states of lying about themselves to themselves. And all those little games that I talked about, the gaslighting, manipulation, we do that to ourselves in order to maintain the status quo of who we think that we're supposed to be in order to survive in the environment around us. And what's more is some of us don't even realize that there are alternate possibilities. In one society, if you hear the statement, in one society, if you hear the statement, godliness or cleanliness is next to godliness, that is a pertinent viewpoint. In another culture, that is asinine. In one, they draw an analog between the idea of having a clean and well-ordered house to having a clean and well-ordered life. In another society, that is a load of garbage, because having a clean and ordered house has absolutely nothing to do with your life, internally or spiritually. Another example, popular phrases, the statement that it is better to keep your burdens to yourself so that you do not burden others with your emotional weight. In one society, that could be deemed very much so. That is a sign of strength. In another society, that is a sign of utter and complete weakness. But see, if you're born into either side, you don't know. Like, you can't see the other perspective necessarily, and you can't necessarily understand that this is different. I have one friend who I've been talking to for years, and he constantly refers to himself as a realist. And for years I've told him over and over and over again, you're not a realist, you're a pessimist with a bad perspective, who thinks he's a realist. Because his entire paradigm, his entire ability to see the world is completely based on his experience. And as we talked about last week, the vast majority of the things that really stick with us when we remember are negative things. The wounds that we intake as we grow and develop, the things that our environment does to hurt us, are the things that usually propagate and take root deepest inside of our psyches, and as a result have the greatest impact on our identities. So, to us, based on our experience purely, we could easily believe a lot of things as being very much true. We could believe that disenfranchisement is a normal state of life, that everyone feels that way, that everyone exists in that kind of world. So when we meet people who don't live that way, or don't feel that way, or don't exist in that kind of mental state, we have two choices. We either be challenged by the idea that we're facing an entity that is alien to us, or we can pretend that they're lying about their lives and try to make believe or contrive in some way that that's impossible. They just haven't realized that they're on my level yet. See, and the problem is that oftentimes the way that people work is that we try to confirm our biases. So if your entire life and existence has revolved around pain, and the avoidance of pain, and the endurance of pain, and the way that every time you try to find a new way of coping, it just leads to more pain, you could begin to be convinced that the idea that to live is to simply exist in a state of pain, that there is no hope, that hope is a lie that's simply used to hurt us over and over and over again. So you begin to carry that kind of mentality, but then when you're faced with people who don't exist that way, have not had that experience, they will challenge you again and again and again, and in order to maintain that bias, you're going to have to work really, really hard. See, the funny thing about it is, like, how many people can you look at and say, oh, they're a liar, they're a fake, before you have to start acknowledging the possibility that your perspective might be what is at fault. And people build their whole identity around these false perspectives. See, the thing about it is that, to give kind of an example, for in terms of your environment, if you take a jaguar and find a way to share with it about the Arctic, it has no convention, no way to base that. You mean the water turns to like a solid object and litters the ground? That animal is not going to have any ability to comprehend that. It only understands the environment which it grew up in. So it lives in the jungles or the plain or the swampy plains, the Pantanal of South America. It understands that. That is its full convention. Its full ability to understand an environment exists within the realm of what it has seen and experienced. It's the same concept as explaining the color to the blind. And the thing of it is that oftentimes we can grow up in situations that are very, very sick. So we're taught things that are damaging. We are taught ways of living, ways of thinking, ways of existing that are destructive. It's kind of like, it's like winding up one of those old wind-up toys where you wind it up to make it so far, but as time passes, it sputters. Because it can't, because that winding only goes so far. And inevitably, its existence starts to fade very quickly. Because it only has so much energy to keep going. For us as people, our mental, physical energy, especially our physical energy, is a limiting factor in our very lives. And sometimes we can be taught things, ways of existing that weigh on that so heavily. In the case of that person carrying all those burdens all on their own, they will take on those burdens. They will carry those burdens, and they will make them their own. And then because of their strong shoulders, they will grab other people's burdens and they will try to carry those. But the reality that we have to acknowledge, and they will have to acknowledge sooner than later, is carrying all of that weight is crippling. It's emotionally and physically exhausting. To show up and be the person who carries the burdens for everybody every time, all the time, to be there again and again and again and again. It's a novel idea, but it's unrealistic for maintaining your own mental and physical health. In the Bible we have the entire concept of Sabbath for a reason. Rest is important. In the Old Testament, it was law that the Israelites had to even give Sabbath to their farmland. The concept of letting fields lay fallow was something they had to go on crop rotations. That's in Deuteronomy, if I remember correctly. So this isn't something foreign to God. He looks at us, says, you guys need to relax once in a while. And we're just like, so by relax, you mean take a day to do errands and take care of all the rest of our life things and go to church? No. No, that is not Sabbath. That's not rest. But we've convinced ourselves that that's exactly what it is. And see, this kind of thing, I use Sabbath, like the misunderstanding of Sabbath, the misunderstanding of rest, as a soft example of destructive mentalities. But there are things that we carry in our culture, in our societies, that are so much worse. We have things ingrained in us that are destructive to ourselves and those around us. Some of us carry mentalities that are predatory, savage, cruel, hypocritical, and not safe hypocritical, like I have double standards. No, I mean really, really toxic hypocritical. The kinds of hypocrisies where we would let ourselves suffer and die while we build up others, while we enforce the beliefs of others. Things like enabling, or to become the kinds of people who judge and just look for ways to continue judging. They're the people who believe that might makes right. So if you are the strongest person in the room, or the loudest, or the most cruel, then that makes you the strongest and the most apt to lead or function. There are people who maintain viewpoints that they are their own gods and should be the ones to dictate everything around them. Do you know what happens when you get a room full of gods? Horrible things. They fight. Anytime that you talk about, like, even when you look at the examples set in mythology, they're constantly at each other's throats. The Egyptian gods literally killed each other, and then raised each other from the dead, and then killed each other again. Norse gods killed each other.
gods too.
Greek gods couldn't die, but man, they did terrible things to each other.
They're jerks.
They were jerks. And this was just the reality that we see. I mean, it's in our mythology. We must have some convention of this, but for whatever reason, we keep trying to put ourselves in that same space. We don't recognize our own limitations. We don't accept them. So we keep putting ourselves in that seat and expecting that we're going to get the best results. And instead, we just end up churning up more and more shit because we're not ready to maintain that kind of existence. We lack the perspective and we lack the discernment to properly decide, to properly handle and navigate every aspect of life. But we try to anyways, because it's all we know. We wholly take everything on ourselves, and Christians are not different. I've seen more Christians with God complexes than I have pagans. I've seen more Christians use God to back their terrible decisions and terrible perspectives, simply applying the words, this is what God would want, or I have peace about this. That's not enough, and that's not acceptable. The last, we did a series just a couple weeks ago that maintained the perspective of what unity with the Holy Spirit looks like. That of being in existence in relationship with God. Not being on your own, doing your own thing, and simply applying God's name to it, but in actuality having a rapport with God Himself where you function in life together. There's an enormous difference. And a lot of Christians don't understand that. Because they don't have most have not had the opportunity to understand that. We claim to seek relationship with God while being told and believing that God wants nothing to do with us, that it's imprudent, or it's selfish, or egotistical, or arrogant, or any number of different things to assume that God would talk to us. I mean, the disciples of Jesus were literally chosen as examples of the kinds of people Jesus seeks relationship with. They weren't, Moses, for example, was a prince of Egypt when God started talking to him. A lot of you had prophets who would come and speak to the Israelite kings. Peter was a fisherman. If I remember right, John and James were also fishermen. Bartholomew, or Nathaniel, depending on which name you want to go with, he was some dude hanging out under a tree who had kind of who had a little bit of wit about him. Matthew was a tax collector. He was effectively like the dreg of society at that time. The Jewish people at the time looked at the tax collectors as being like trash people. They had the same level of respect for Jews that they had for tax collectors that they had for prostitutes and so on. Like, they just thought they were garbage. Matthew, the Apostle Matthew, was a tax collector when Jesus said, "Hey, you want to come follow me? I'm going to teach. We're going to live life together for a while, and you're going to learn about God." So as a result, nobody really appreciates that. So instead, we sit there and think that they must have been so special and chosen. In reality, that's not even remotely true. They were chosen, sure. But the whole point in who they were was to illustrate that it's not about station. Anyways, so in a lot of churches, we grow up in these situations where, we're taught to be that same way. Like we live with this perspective, and that's our environment. As we share that perspective, and then the people who learn it from us share it with others, and so you have an environment created around lies, created around false perceptions. And that's where so many of us live. Whether it's in the world outside the church, whether it's in the church, all throughout our existence, we live with false perceptions. Last week when I was talking about it, there were three major problems that any psychologist has to deal with when they're talking to people. The one I couldn't remember was, in fact, perspective. So perspective, memory, and delusion. These are the three greatest hurdles for anybody in psychology trying to help people understand themselves, understand their circumstances, because their perception will oftentimes sculpt their memories, and their memories will be sculpted by their perceptions. And delusion can be maintained by either of those things, because memories can change. You might remember something differently, or you might miss details at one point or another. And that's normal. So a lot of us, based off of these kind of like faulty things, we create identities of ourselves. And like I was saying last week, one of the big things with identity is that most of us, as we try to create identities, we reach for things that have nothing to do with our character or personality. Like I talked about last week, we gravitate towards things like when somebody asks who you are, most people will answer with things like their job title. They might also answer with their race, their religion, their gender, their sexual identity, their cultural heritage, like I'm Italian, I'm Russian. They don't come with a skin color necessarily, but they come with a specific culture. They might use their dietary preferences. And see, the problem with this is that these things, at best, are descriptive traits that help point people in the direction of learning who you are. At worst, which I have experienced more than anything else, they are gross stereotypes that people have grafted onto their own personalities in order to try to generate some caricature of being a person. If who you are is dictated by your environment or your society as opposed to your individual heart, that's not who you are. That's who you're making yourself be. And that's a lie. Over and over and over again, it's a lie. And the more that you have to lie to yourself to convince yourself that this is your truth, the more tangled that web is going to become. The harder and harder and harder it is going to be in order for you to get free as you wrap yourself in that web and tangle yourself up more and more and more. You can absolutely gaslight yourself. You can absolutely manipulate yourself. You can literally brainwash yourself. I have a friend who's done it. He sat down at one point and tried to convince himself that his memories were different than they were. He literally created false memories in order to try to cope with his past. I actually have a couple of friends who've done that, come to think of it. They created false narratives about their life in order to deal with trauma. Doesn't help. Lying about who you are doesn't help you be more yourself. This is why imposter syndrome is one of the more common psychological problems that's faced by people in our day. That and anxiety disorders. I mean, look, part of the reason why I realized the tedium of like what I was taught to do was because it was incredibly... It created an atmosphere of anxiety. There was always the concern that I was going to be found out for not being who I said I was. Well, if you have to be afraid of being found out as not being who you say you are, that should clue you into the possibility that maybe you're not who you say you are. And if you're not who you say you are, then who are you? And you should be devoting your energy into discovering that, as opposed to trying to maintain this facade. It's crippling. It imprisons us in a state of fear and doubt and anxiety, and it only creates more opportunities for pain. What happens when you've spent 10 years convincing yourself that you're one type of person, only to have that moment where you have to accept that you're not who you thought you were? It's not good. I can promise you that. I've seen it happen so many times. I've had it happen. It's jarring. It just destroys you. And that's why we talk about... That's where, as Christians, we lean on God. Because the thing about it is that all of this stuff I'm talking about, this is sickness. It's emotional, spiritual illness. Everyone's afraid that if they are their true self, no one will accept them. Fine. At some point we have to acknowledge the possibility, acknowledge the reality that, one, you can do everything right and still fail. You can still lose. It doesn't matter how good you are or how bad you are in that regard. Life will still present situations where you lose. The other big thing here is that you also have to accept that, in dovetailing off of that not everyone will like you. Years ago, when we talked about offices and the different spiritual offices that we all have, how, the 5 of them, and at other times we've talked about in other messages, I can recall, where we talked about the individual giftings of people and the way that we're all differently built, the way that God favors individuality in this regard, that He creates us all different, is that in order to reach people, it sometimes requires a different touch. As a result, not everyone likes all those kinds of people. Some people love the people who are loud and boisterous and just can talk hype and rev people up. Some people love those people. They migrate to those people. They come to those people in droves. Other people, like me, despise them. Or just can't handle it. They're so obnoxious. It's actually repulsive. That energy is repulsive. So that people migrate to... Then on the other side of it, you've got people who are much more relaxed, low-key. They're gentle, sometimes to a fault. And that might be somebody else's taste. Those people who love the boisterous people might see those people as being weak or not caring enough, or any number of judgments. And they might be completely invalid to judge that way, but that's the way it goes. They automatically don't like those people. And there's a huge spectrum in between this. So yes, I promise you that if you are your most honest self, people will not like you. Also, people will like you. You get both. There's no universal response. Like, well, not without trying really hard to get one specific universal response. And see, the thing about it is that the irony in all of this is that a lot of us can't grow into being like the most authentic versions of ourselves, or the best versions of ourselves, for lack of a better way to put it. To be more precise, we can't grow past the weakness and illness that we have all endured created by our environments without actually being authentic. See, it's only in that authenticity that we're allowed to see that maybe this isn't quite right. It's only when we stand back and say, okay, this is who I am, then we have to acknowledge when we're the bad guy in the story, when it is in fact us who have been doing the bad things. Because if you spend all of your time and devoting it, or, maybe it's not even that you did something bad, but you were the one who created your own calamity in trying to be this version of yourself that you want people to believe in, you've actually created more damage because you were trying to be liked. And in the end, that's your fault. You did it. But that won't be something that's seen without taking that step back. And the thing about sickness, like these things, is that it's easy for other people to see. I was watching this video. It was a middle ground video where they were talking about, I've been watching a few of them, and this is kind of like this thing that I see maintained. But there was this, it was talking to polyandrous people versus monogamous people. And somebody in the comments underneath the video made a comment about how all the comments were so much in favor of the monogamous people. Well, the reason for that was the obvious sickness that was being seen on the screen for the polyandrous ones. Like, whatever you believe about that, the individuals on this video who were supporting polyandry, one of them was a guy who had literally just gotten out of a 20-year marriage, and now his entire explanation was all about himself. What he wanted, making himself happy, what he thought was best for himself, and just kind of continuing on that kind of mindset. The guy was obviously hurt after getting out of a 20-year marriage where he probably didn't feel like he could be himself for 20 years. And this was all plain to see, and especially in the way that he described what his marriage was like. Another person was purely interested in their own designs, their own self. They didn't actually love the other people that they were involved with. It was just who pleased them the most. The other person liked being polyandrous because it made them feel validated. It made them feel wanted. They got to, if it wasn't one guy, it was the other guy who would sleep with them and then make them feel valid. It was easy to see this stuff. Anybody watching this video could see it in these people. So yeah, like this kind of sickness, this stuff, it comes through. It's why it's so awkward sometimes to be in a room with it. And this is where we talk about that the kind of freedom that we seek from this. I shared with you about my experience with Satanism in order to give a context for just how entrapping this whole thing can be. False identity doesn't make you a stronger, better person. Faking it till you make it, trying to be somebody else, will not give you harbor as you try to find refuge from this world and the troubles of it. It will create more problems. It will create more work. It will wear you down. And in the end, as Christians, we should be seeking that relationship with God and the freedom that comes with that. Because to go back to last week and talk about that particular point, the renewal of the mind, the baptism of the Spirit, is the renewal of the mind, the expansion of our minds as God shares that portion of himself with us, like a download that offers a greater variety of possibilities and insights into why things are built the way that they are by him. Seeing beyond the scope of our environment, beyond the scope of our existence and experiences, and seeing possibilities that expand our understanding and our ability to grasp reality. It's like when the reason why it's described as baptism, specifically it's described as baptism by fire. Jesus says it, and also it's in Hebrews as well. Oftentimes the way that they used fire back in these days was to purge parts of the environment. So if you had a field that you needed all the weeds off of, you would set up a controlled burn. You'd light the field on fire to kill all the plants and everything that were there that were undesirable. And the interesting thing about that is that the ash left over would actually allow for the field to become more fertile. So you till it, you work the ash into it, and that'll actually give nourishment to the soil. This concept of purging with fire is a prevalent thing throughout the Gospels. Fire burns everything away. It leaves nothing but ash in its wake. And although it's destructive, in some cases it can also be very important for granting the opportunity to build. In some descriptions, they describe it as being like dross being burnt off of gems as God tests us and puts us through different trials. Well, dross is like when you take a raw gem or a raw piece of ore from the earth, you break it from the rocks, and then you have to burn all the impurities out of it, all the other rocks attached to it and things like that. That way you can have it in its purest form. That's effectively what this is describing. So the environment, the stuff that you've entrapped yourself in, the webbing, as it were, that has to be burnt off. When it becomes so tangled that you can't find the strands to start unwrapping yourself, where do you turn? God has the ability to just burn the whole thing off of you. That's the process of sanctification. That's where God and us start to meet in spirit and mind and learn from one another as he works with us to move us out of that place where we have had so many things become, this is my reality. Well, no, it's not your reality. You have so many options. You have so many ways that you can live and believe and see things. Your experiences no longer dictate your ability to understand life. Instead, you are granted the opportunity, as that has been washed away or burnt away. And now what you're left with is an openness, a freedom to explore new possibilities and new perceptions. This is where renewal is so important. This is why baptism of the Spirit is so important. That's how it works. That's how it moves through us. That's the practical application and where we find freedom in it. You think of the way that when you get in the if you've ever like gotten really dirty working. I do this often working in the barn. I'll get covered in all kinds of horse crap and dust, especially on a day like today, covered in hay. So all this combination of things, and maybe some sweat as a result of just working out there. As a result of those things, I go into shower, and it feels so incredibly spectacular to just have the water just rinse that stuff off of me. That's effectively what happens to our spirits and minds here. That's the idea. That's why baptism is the analog that we use, the metaphor that we use. And that's what we're called for. We're called into. There's places where God tries to draw us into this existence because, one, it is a lot easier. There's one line, and it's kind of like the charter for our little church group here. Our church. And Jesus says, it's in Matthew 11, starting in verse 28. Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." God's yoke and burden, like, these things are light, they're easy, they're simplistic. In the freedom that we find from this world, from the way that the world interprets life, the way that our environments dictate a certain form of existence, we're able to receive an expanded understanding, but also a simplified understanding that is able to free us from the convolution that so much of the world offers us. I think oftentimes about a movie that I watched. I can't remember. Immortals. It was The Immortals. And there was this scene where Henry Cavill goes into a temple. And he has to go through all these winding passages and really complicated stairways and all these bizarre kinds of little turnabouts and things in order to find the central chamber. And I remember when I was watching that, I was kind of talking to God as I was watching it, and I was just like, wow, that is really complicated. And God's response to that was just like, yeah, that's how men believe that anything high and mighty is supposed to be. The more complicated it is, the more divine it must be. Whereas the entire story of the gospel is literally God putting in an easy button with Jesus, fast-tracking us into relationship with him through his Holy Spirit. He's literally just like, okay, just take this part of me, make it a part of you, and we will move on from there together. It's as straightforward as it can be. He'll carry the burdens and carry the yoke. and make it all light and easy. We don't do that for ourselves. Not very often. So, now we'll take some time and pray and just kind of offer up the opportunity for people, like on your own, of your own volition, that whole thing, quietly. You don't have to do it out loud. To just surrender, to just give this stuff to God and to simplify things. Because it really can be, we have a capacity to make things complex that's so, it's crippling. But more than anything, it's about being freed from kind of the self-taught lies, the environment-inspired lies that we maintain without knowing that we maintain them. You know, you can't see. The reality of blind spots is that you can't see them. Whether it's because you've convinced yourself that they don't exist, or because they're literally just in a spot that's beyond your perception. But that's what I've got for tonight.